Okay, before we begin, we've had news of the aunt of one of the team members passing away at quite a young age. So we pray to Allah for forgiveness for her and patience for the family. And as always, I think it's good we recite Surah Al-Fatiha. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العلي العظيم. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله ولا أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So tonight we don't begin with a crisis or a migration or a martyrdom. We begin with 10 words in English. 10 words spoken by Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, over 1,000 years before we gathered here this evening. 10 words that diagnose a disease of the human heart with such precision that every age since has found itself in their mirror. And the words are, the references of course were in the write-up, the words are, people are the enemies of what they do not know. 10 words. And yet within them is the entire story of the two men that we will meet tonight and over the course of the coming weeks. Two brothers, born of one mother, taught by one teacher, raised in one of the most dangerous and most glorious cities the Muslim world has ever produced, Baghdad, in the 4th and 5th centuries after the Hijrah. A city where philosophers walked alongside fanatics, where libraries were built in one generation and burnt in the next, where a Shi'i family could be honored in the courts of power and threatened in the streets in the same week. Tonight we meet Sayyedah al-Radhi and al-Murtadha, the one who gave us Nahj al-Balagha, the book from which moments ago we recited, and the one who taught the man that would build Najaf. These two brothers stood in an arena surrounded by scholars and theologians who did not know them, did not understand them, and in their ignorance opposed them. And the answer these two brothers gave to that hostility was not retreat, it was not silence, it was not compromise. Their answer was knowledge, refined, defended, transmitted, and written down, so that 1,000 years later, on a Wednesday evening, far from the banks of the Tigris or the Dijla River, we can still sit together and hear the words of Imam Ali, preserved by one brother, defended by the other, and tested in the fire of every opposing school of their age. People are the enemies of what they do not know. And the response of the scholar to that enmity, Sayyedah al-Radhi and al-Murtadha, will teach us tonight is to teach, even when those around them do not wish to learn, especially when those around them do not wish to learn. Now, before we go further tonight, a word about where we're going, because what we're about to begin is not a single session. When I first sat down to write tonight's session, tonight's majlis, I expected, as we've done in previous sessions of this sub-series, to deliver one complete portrait from birth to legacy in a single evening. But as the work unfolded, something became very clear. The story of these two brothers is not a story that can be told in one sitting. It's too rich. It carries too much that the Shi'i community needs to hear, and too much that, if we rushed it, would land as a mere list of names rather than as the living tradition that we're trying to honor. The two brothers themselves lived their lives across more than 80 years. They produced books that shaped 1,000 years of scholarship. They trained students who carried their inheritance from Baghdad to Tripoli to Aleppo to Najaf. They lived inside an intellectual world populated by Ibn Sina, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, and the rising shadow of Ghazali. They were buried in Karbala beside their father, beside their grandfather, the master of the martyrs. And what their story finally asks us at its end is to think honestly about the difference between religion and the abuse of religion. The difference between the genuine theological commitments of Sunni and Shi'i believers across history and the political projects that have used both traditions as cloaks for worldly ambitions. This is not a small ask, and it deserves more than the closing 5 minutes of an exhausted majlis. So I made a decision. You'll recall in the previous session, session 64, when we first began in earnest the architecture of guidance, I said this to you. Over the past 3 sessions, we've been covering a great deal of ground each week. Entire centuries, multiple scholars, vast historical arcs. The material ahead of us is too rich and too important to continue at that pace. Beginning tonight, we're going to slow down. Not because there is less to say, but because there is more. And I also said, there is a wisdom the scholars of medicine have always known. When a person has been without food for a long time, you don't place a feast before them. You give nourishment carefully, in measure, so that the body can receive it. Our community, unfortunately, has been starved of this knowledge for a very long time. We will, God willing, feed it, but with care. Tonight, we honor that same principle once more. The story of al-Radhi and al-Murtadha will be told across 4 sessions, not 1. Tonight, session 65, we meet them as boys. We meet their father and we meet their mother. We meet the lineage that they carried in their blood and the household that prepared them. We watch the dream that brought them to Sheikh al-Mufid, and we stand with them at the threshold of their lives, the soil prepared, ready for what was about to grow. Next week, God willing, session 66, we will walk the full life of the younger brother, al-Radhi, the poet who became a compiler, the scholar who lived Nahj al-Balagha before he gave it to the world, the public man who refused 1,000 dinars rather than betray his principles. We will walk with him to his early grave at the age of 47, and we will stand at his funeral as the vizier of the Abbas al-Khalif himself steps in to lead the prayer the elder brother could not bear to lead. The week after that, session 67, we will walk the full life of the elder brother, al-Murtadha. 30 years of carrying the work forward alone. The 5 books that became the foundation of every Hawza in the world. The dream through which his great ancestor gave him a title he refused before he accepted. The library of 80,000 volumes and the 4 students he dispatched across the Mediterranean to plant the seed in soil that fire could not reach. And in the 4th and final week, session 68, we will meet the world that has surrounded them. Ibn Sina, the Mu'tazilites, the rising Ash'ariyah, and the looming shadow of al-Ghazali. We will watch the library burn. We will see what survived the burning, and we will pause, gravely and honestly, to ask what this whole story is for, what it teaches us about the difference between the tradition we have inherited and the political projects, ancient and modern, Shi'i and Sunni and beyond, that have draped themselves in religion's clothing while serving entirely different masters. We will close that 4th week, by God's permission, at the graves of the 2 brothers in Karbala, with our eyes raised towards the one in whose service they lived and they died, our beloved Imam, the Mahdi of this age. May our souls be his ransom, and may God hasten his return. This is not a delay. It is the work the material demands. And it is, in its own way, a continuation of the principles al-Radhi and al-Murtadha lived by themselves. That knowledge transmitted in haste is knowledge that does not transmit at all. So tonight, 2 boys, 1 mother, 1 teacher. 1 household where every day the words of Imam Ali, their ancestor and their Imam, were spoken as though the commander of the faithful himself might walk through the door. Let us begin. Please give me a loud salawat. We move on to the main introduction. We began this journey some weeks ago by asking a question. How did the Marja'iyyah we know today, the Hawza in Qom, the Hawza in Najaf, the scholarly hierarchy that anchors our community, how did it come to be? Who built it? What crises shaped it? And through whose hands was the light of the Imams carried in the long night of occultation? Tonight we begin to answer a part of that question by meeting two men. Two men who, unlike every figure we've met thus far in this series so far, come to us not as individuals, but as a pair, brothers, Sayyedah Radhi and Sayyedah Murtadha. And here, before we go any further, a small clarification. Some of you will have heard these two men referred to by a different title, as Sharif al-Radhi and Sharif al-Murtadha. And some may have asked, quite reasonably, was it not Sharif al-Radhi who compiled Nahj al-Balagha? How can it be the same man? It is the same man. Sayyid and Sharif are two honorifics given to the descendants of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and his righteous companions. Both signify nobility of lineage. Sharif from the Arabic sharafa, to be elevated, to be honored, and Sayyid from Sada, to be a master, a chief and a leader. In the age we're entering tonight, the 4th and 5th century Baghdad, Sharif was the dominant honorific used for the Alid nobility, the descendants of Imam Ali, nobility of the Abbasid capital. And in fact, these two brothers' father, Sayyid Abu Ahmed Husayn ibn Musa, held one of the highest offices that an Alid could hold in that world. He was the Naqib al-Talibiyin. And let me pause to explain what that office means, Naqib al-Talibiyin, because it tells you much about the world into which our two brothers were born. The Naqib al-Talibiyin was the official overseer of all the descendants of Abu Talib, which in practice means all the descendants of Imam Ali and his brothers. In the Abbasid administrative system and later under the Buyids, the Alids were a recognized class, formally registered, formally represented, formally entitled to certain stipends from the pious endowments made for the descendants of the Prophet. The Naqib was the man who maintained the genealogical register, guarding the lineage against impostors. He settled disputes within the Alid community. He represented their interests at the Caliph's court. He administered the endowments that supported them. In a city where, in the wrong decade, being a Shi'i could still get a man killed in the streets, the Naqib was the Alid community's official voice in the halls of power. So when we say their father was a Sharif, we do not mean it only that he carried the blood. We mean he was a recognized, titled, state-registered representative of the Prophet's descendants in the capital of the Islamic world of the time. And our two brothers were born into that house. They grew up under the weight of that expectation and would both, in turn, later in life, hold that same office themselves. So the biographical sources of their own age and the centuries immediately after recorded our two brothers as Sharif al-Radhi and Sharif al-Murtadha. Over time, regional customs shifted. In the Hijaz, Sharif came to cluster around the Hassanid line, the descendants of Imam Hassan, most famously in the ruling Sharifs of Mecca, whose descendants went on to establish royal houses across several modern states, including one that we have today, which is the so-called Kingdom of Jordan, and others. And in the broader Shia world, Sayyid gradually displaced Sharif as the universal honorific for the descendants of the Prophet, regardless of which Imam they trace their lineage through. So tonight, I will use Sayyid Radhi and Sayyid Murtadha in keeping with our own Shi'i usage of the day. But when you hear Sharif al-Radhi and Sharif al-Murtadha elsewhere, know that it is the same men, same lineage, same brothers. And their lineage, for the record, is Husayni through both parents. Their father's line traces to Imam Musa al-Kadhim, peace and blessings be upon him, and their mothers to Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him. They carry in their blood the bond of two of the Imams whose legacy they would spend their lives defending. But let me pause here, because there is a danger in everything that I have said about titles and lineages. The title Sayyid, the title Sharif, the blood tie to the noblest family that ever walked this earth, it is an honor. It is not a guarantee. And the respect we owe to the descendants of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and righteous companions, that respect is owed in love, in care, and in kindness. It was never meant to be a claim to privilege, nor a caste standing above the rest of the believers. This is not my inference. It is what the Quran itself teaches. In Surah al-Hujurat, the 49th chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the chambers, verse number 13, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you." The most noble. Akramakum, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most noble of you is the one with the most taqwa, the most righteousness, the most God awareness. Not the one with the noblest blood. Not the one with the oldest family name. Not the one whose lineage traces to the Prophet. The one with the most God consciousness. And lest anyone imagine that the sacred lineages are somehow exempt from this measure, the Quran, again in Surah al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, addresses that very question head on. When Prophet Ibrahim, peace and blessings be upon him, was tested by his Lord, and he passed every test, his Lord said to him, and this is from Quran, Surah al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 124. Allah says, "And remember when his Lord tested Abraham with certain commands, and he fulfilled them. He said, 'Indeed, I am making you an imam for humanity.' And Abraham said, 'And from my descendants?' He said, 'My covenant does not reach the wrongdoers.'" Even Ibrahim, the Khalil, the friend of God, could not bequeath his sacred station as a bloodline inheritance. When he asked gently, lovingly, "And what of my offspring, my Lord?" the answer was not a simple yes. The answer was, "La yanalu ahd al-zalimin." My covenant does not reach the unjust. Even if they are of Prophet Abraham's line, even if they are of Prophet Muhammad's line, even if they wear the title Sayyid or Sharif upon their name. This is why our tradition has always been careful to separate the blessings of lineage from the measure of a person. A descendant of the Prophet who lives with taqwa, God consciousness, who serves the people, who carries the weight of the name with humility, that person honors the ancestor they inherited. And a descendant who claims the title but forgets the example, remember who the example was. It was Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, who, when he ruled half the known world of the time, kept the mud brick house, wore the patched cloak, and ate his bread with salt. The ancestor of our two brothers tonight. If the ancestor refused the palaces of his own age in the name of God, what measure should we take of any descendant in any age who trades the example for the title alone? And that is why 1,000 years after their deaths, we still speak the names of al-Radhi and al-Murtadha with reverence, not because of the blood in their veins, which they did not choose, but because of what they did with it. They used their name to teach, to defend, to carry the words of Imam Ali forward for every generation that would come after them, including ours. Born 4 years apart, raised in the same house, taught by the same teacher, buried in the same city, and between them, in the space of a single generation, they gave our tradition two gifts that cannot be separated. One brother compiled the book that has been called the gateway to Imam Ali, Nahj al-Balagha, and the other brother became the undisputed leader of the Shi'a for 23 years after their teacher's death, and trained the man who would found the Hawza of Najaf. That is why they came to us across these 4 sessions together, because their story and the tradition's debt to them cannot be told apart. Our structure across the four parts we've already gone through, but it follows the same three movements distributed across the 4 weeks, the same four movements that we have generally: formation, contribution, departure, and legacy. And tonight we'll be covering formation, where we will meet the mother whose decision changed a civilization. So now we begin every story where every story must begin, at the beginning. But before that, let us briefly recap the previous session. But before that, please give me a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So last week we sat with a man who by the end of his life had become the most important Shia scholar in the world, Sheikh al-Mufid, the beneficial one. We followed him from his origins in Uqbara, a small town on the banks of the Tigris, about 60 or so kilometers north of Baghdad, in what is today the Saladin government of Iraq, to the Mimbar, the pulpit of the greatest scholarly authority of his age. We saw how he took that tradition that Sheikh al-Kulayni and Sheikh al-Saduq had preserved in hadith, preserved in text, and gave it a voice, the voice of rational theology, of trained argument, of scholars who could walk into the courtrooms of the Boyid Caliphs and into the mosques and debating halls of Karkh and stand their ground in any language the opposing school wished to speak. And we ended last week with a dream in which, as the biographical sources record it, a woman came to Sheikh al-Mufid in his sleep, and she was Sayyedah Fatima al-Zahra, peace and blessings be upon her. And she said to him, "Take these two my sons and teach them." When Sheikh al-Mufid awoke, he rose and walked to the mosque of Karkh, the Shi'i quarter of Baghdad, as we mentioned. And there waiting for him was a mother with her two young sons, asking him to teach them. Those two sons are tonight's session. The chain now has a shape. Sheikh al-Kulayni and Sheikh al-Saduq, they preserved. Sheikh al-Mufid, he defended and systematized. And now, in this generation, al-Radhi and al-Murtadha inherit the torch, theologically, politically, intellectually, literally. The torch will pass through al-Murtadha into the hands of the student who will carry it out of Baghdad altogether, when Baghdad itself begins to burn. This is now where we will pick up. Please give me a salawat. We move to the main section, which is the formation: 2 sons, 1 mother, and 1 teacher. In the city of Baghdad, in the year 355 after the Hijrah, which in the reckoning of the Common Era is around 966, a boy was born into a noble house on the west bank of the Tigris. His father named him Ali. The world would come to know him as Sharif al-Murtadha, and later as Sayyid Murtadha, Alim al-Huda, the banner of guidance. 4 years later, in the year 359 of the Hijrah, a second son was born to the same mother and the same father. His father named him Muhammad. The world would come to know him as Sharif al-Radhi, Sayyid Radhi, and every student of the Arabic language, of Islamic thought, of political philosophy, of spiritual reflection, of the art of eloquence itself, for 1,000 years and more after his death, and until the end of the world, would quietly owe him a debt for the one book he would give them before he was buried, Nahj al-Balagha, the peak of eloquence. A book that the great Sunni reformer of al-Azhar, Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, published and championed. The same Sheikh Muhammad Abduh who would later become the Grand Mufti of Egypt and one of the most influential Sunni reformers of the 19th century. A book whose most comprehensive classical commentary runs to 20 volumes and was written not by a Shi'i, but by a Mu'tazilite scholar of the 7th century of Hijrah, Ibn Abil Hadid, a man who could not put the book down, even though he did not share the compiler's creed. A book whose passages Arab school children, have memorized for 1,000 years to learn what their language at its highest register sounds like. A book whose letter number 53 to Malik al-Ashtar on the governance of Egypt is today studied in the departments of political philosophy as one of the most comprehensive treatises on just rulership ever produced in the classical world. And in our own age, a book that has taken its place on the shelves of the great academic houses of the West. The most recent scholarly edition and translation of Nahj al-Balagha was published a mere 2 years ago, in the year 2024 of the Common Era, by the Laudian Professor of Arabic at the University of Oxford, and brought out by Brill of Leyden, one of the oldest and most respected academic presses in the world, a press that was founded in the year 1683. The Emeritus Professor of Arabic at Oxford called the work a major achievement and described Nahj al-Balagha itself as one of the most revered Arabic texts among both Sunni and Shia Muslims alike. In other words, a book that has outgrown its boundary, every boundary its compiler might have imagined for it. A book that belongs today not only to the Shia, not only to the Muslims, not only to the Arabic-speaking world, but to the heritage of all of humanity itself. And the man who gave it to us, who collected, arranged, preserved, and published these words of his ancestor when no one else had thought to do so, is the boy whose name his father had just whispered into his ear as the call to prayer rose over the 4th century in Baghdad. And a word about those names themselves, al-Murtadha and al-Radhi. Because, like the title al-Mufid that we sat with last week, these were not random honorifics. They were chosen, and they were chosen to carry meaning. Both names come from a single root in the Arabic language, the root Radhiya, a root that turns in every direction you look at it around a single idea. You can look in the footnotes for more technical details. But the idea is divine pleasure, approval, contentment, acceptance. But the two names take that single root in two different directions. Al-Radhi is the active form. It means the one who is pleased, the one who is content, the one who is doing the pleasing, pleased with what God has decreed, pleased with his portion of this world, pleased in the way the Quran speaks of the returning soul at the end of Surah Al-Fajr, one of the most beloved passages in the Quran, from Surah Al-Fajr, the chapter of the dawn, 89th chapter of the Quran, verses 27 to 28, where Allah says, O soul at peace, return to your Lord, well pleased and well pleasing. Radhiya, the soul that is pleased with God. It's from the same form linguistically as al-Radhi. And al-Murtadha is the passive form, but from a deeper term of the same verb. It means the one approved, the one chosen, the one whom God has selected. Not the one doing the pleasing, but the one who has been found pleasing. It is the word the Quran uses when it speaks of the messengers of God that God has chosen. In Quran, Surah Al-Jinn, the chapter of the Jinn, 72nd chapter of the Quran, verses 26 to 27, Allah says, He is the knower of the unseen, and He does not disclose His unseen to anyone, except to him whom He has approved, chosen as His messenger. So here are two names from the same root, pointing at two faces of the same divine reality. One son named for pleasing God, and the other son named for being chosen by God, the two faces of a single coin. And together, given by the same father to his two sons, they drew from the same well, a father's prayer, whispered at the hour of their naming, that these two boys, born into the heaviest lineage a Muslim could carry, would grow up to be pleased with God in every circumstance and pleasing to God in every act. That whatever this world threw at them, wealth, poverty, honor, humiliation, power, or exile, they would stand at the end of their lives as the kind of souls to whom the Quran addresses its gentlest invitation. Return to your Lord, well pleased and well pleasing. It was the prayer of a father, and, as we shall see across these 4 sessions, that prayer was answered. Their father was Sayyid Abu Ahmad Husayn ibn Musa al-Musawi, the Naqib al-Talibiyin of Baghdad that we've just spoken of. a man of such standing in the Abbasid capital that when disputes broke out between the Khalif and the Buyid princes, he was among the few trusted enough to mediate between them. 7 times across the course of his long life, Sayyid Abu Ahmed held the position of Naqib. 7 times he stepped away from it or was removed by political turbulence. And 7 times he was called back to it, because no other alid in Baghdad could hold it the way he did. Their mother was Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn, a noble woman of a scholarly family in her own right. Her father was known as al-Nasir al-Saghir and her grandfather was al-Nasir al-Kabir. Now let me pause here and explain these names, because they will mean little to most of us today, but they carried enormous weight in the Shi'i world of the 4th century of the Hijrah. Al-Nasir al-Saghir, the younger Nasir, was a prominent Alid chieftain of northern Iran, a descendant of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, peace and blessings be upon him, through his son Omar al-Ashraf. His title al-Saghir distinguished him from his own father, al-Nasir al-Kabir, the elder al-Nasir, better known to history as Hasan al-Atrush. And Hasan al-Atrush was, in his age, something quite extraordinary. He was a scholar, a poet, a jurist, a narrator of hadith, and at the same time a warrior who, some 50 years before our 2 brothers were born, had led the Alids of his region to establish an independent state in the lands of Tabaristan, the coastal region of the Caspian Sea in what is today the Mazandaran province of northern Iran. He had died in battle in the year 304 of the Hijrah, fighting to preserve what he had built. And his memory, the memory of an Alid who carried the honor of his lineage not just in his blood but in his scholarship, his poetry, his sword, and ultimately his life, there was still living memory in the Alid households of Baghdad when his great-grandsons were born. This was Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn's inheritance, paternal and maternal alike, for she was also the granddaughter of scholars on her mother's sides. And as the biographical sources record her, she was a woman who knew exactly what her 2 sons carried in their veins and exactly what she wanted them to become. This was the household into which these 2 brothers were born. A household of wealth, yes, but wealth in Baghdad in the 4th century of Hijrah was never secure. A household of political standing, yes, but political standing in that city, in that age, was a position at the mouth of a lion's den. The Abbasid Khalif sat on the throne, but the Buyid princes held the real power. The Shi'i quarter of Karkh and the Sunni quarter known as Bab al-Basra would, in the wrong month, descend into open street fighting. Scholars would walk away from their houses to the mosque past the ashes of a library that had been burnt the night before. And in the middle of all of this, an Alid family was expected by the Khalif, by the Buyids, by the Shi'i community, by the wider Ummah, to produce leaders, scholars, judges, men who could hold the line. Into that world, these 2 boys were born. 2 boys who, it was very clear early on, were not ordinary. So, last week we ended with a dream. And we end this week's opening with the same dream, because last week it was told from the perspective of the teacher, and this week it must be told from the perspective of the mother. The biographical sources record the episode with remarkable consistency. Sheikh al-Mufid, who we of course met last week, the beneficial one, the most learned Shia scholar of his age, was asleep one night in his home in Baghdad. And in his sleep he saw a woman come to him. And the woman was Sayyedah Fatima al-Zahra, peace and blessings be upon her, the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and righteous companions. The mother of our Imams and the mistress of the women of the worlds. And she was holding the hands of her 2 young sons, al-Hasan and Husayn, peace and blessings be upon them. And she said to Shaykh al-Mufid, "Take my 2 sons, teach them jurisprudence." And the Shaykh awoke. Now, as the biographical sources tell us, he was startled, disturbed, bewildered even. What could such a dream mean? He rose, he performed his prayers, and, as was his custom and habit, walked from his home to the mosque of Karkh to begin his day's teaching. As he approached the mosque, he saw, waiting at the entrance, a woman. She was surrounded by attendants, as befitted a noblewoman of her rank. Her two young sons stood beside her, and she spoke to Sheikh al-Mufid with the directness of a mother who knows that the man she is addressing is the most important teacher in the city and that her time with him is limited. She said, "O Sheikh, these are my two sons. I have brought them to you that you may teach them." The two boys, of course, were Sayyid Ali and Sayyid Muhammad, Sayyid al-Murtadha and Sayyid al-Radhi. And the mother was Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn. And Sheikh al-Mufid, looking at the two children before him and remembering the dream he had just awoken from, understood what had happened. The biographical sources tell us very simply, he wept. He recounted the dream to her, and he took them on as his students. The earliest and most detailed preservation of the incident reaches us through Ibn Abil Hadid, the great Mu'tazilite commentator we met earlier tonight, who recorded it in his celebrated commentary on Nahj al-Balagha. He said, and the reference of course is in the write-up, he said, the next morning after the night in which he had seen the dream, Fatima bint al-Nasir, she's also known as Fatima bint al-Husayn and Fatima bint al-Nasir, entered the mosque to see him, surrounded by her servants, and with her two sons, Muhammad al-Radhi and Ali al-Murtadha, walking before her. He rose and greeted her. She said to him, "O Shaykh, these are my two sons whom I have brought to you so that you may teach them jurisprudence." Abu Abdullah, meaning Shaykh al-Mufid, wept and recounted to her the dream and undertook their education. And this account was carried forward centuries later into the great Shia encyclopedic tradition by Allama Majlisi, who we will meet in this series, but further down, who gathered it into his monumental Bihar al-Anwar, the Ocean of Lights, which even today sits on the shelf of every serious student of Islam as the largest compilation of Shia narrations ever assembled. Through Allama Majlisi's collection, the story of a mother, a teacher, and a dream was preserved for us 1,000 years later in this very Majlis. And thus began a relationship between one teacher and two students that would, in a single generation, reshape the intellectual landscape of Shi'ism. So pause with me here for a moment before we leave the mother and her two boys at the Mosque of Karkh. What this episode tells us, and it tells us something that our tradition has known for 14 centuries, and that our age has largely forgotten, is that the family is the first institution of learning. Before the madrasa, before the Hawza, before the seminary, before any formal institution of any kind, there is the mother who decides that her sons will be something. And there is the father whose standing gives them the means. And there is the household whose atmosphere teaches them what to value before they know the word for value. Had Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn not made the decision she made that morning, there would be no Nahj al-Balagha as we know it today. There would be no al-Huda to lead the Shia after Shaykh al-Mufid's passing. There would be no Shaykh al-Tusi trained as he was trained, because Shaykh al-Tusi would train under Sayyid Murtadha for 23 years. The entire chain, the entire scholarly lineage we are tracing in this sub-series hinged at that one moment on the decision of a mother to walk her children to the mosque. And let me say a word to the parents in this gathering, because there is nothing more important that I could say tonight. The pursuit of knowledge in our children begins long before the first day of school. It begins in what we allow in our homes, in what we consume in front of our children, in which scholars we listen to at the dinner table and which distractions we refuse to make space for, in whether the first book in a child's hand is a book the angels would smile upon or something that will rot them from the inside. Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn did not take her children to the Mosque of Karkh that morning on a whim. She had been preparing them for that moment in the quiet of her home for years. And let me be plain here. because the age we are living in has made this lesson urgent in a way that previous generations perhaps did not feel with the same weight. We are raising our children in a world where the institutions that were a generation or perhaps two ago, the natural partners of the family in the formation of a child, have in many places drifted far, far away from that partnership. Drifted into territory that, if we are truly honest with ourselves, no serious believing parent can ignore. Our schools, particularly in the West, and not least here in the UK, have become places where children are increasingly formed in ideas and ideologies that their parents never consented to, where fundamentals, language, mathematics, sciences, humanities, the history of civilizations, compete for air with the preoccupations of the moment. Agendas that confuse children about their own bodies and their own identities, the most basic questions of who they are, and do so at ages where a child cannot yet process such weight. Where in some cases schools have been advised not to tell parents about changes their own child is going through. And where under government programs framed in the language of safeguarding, teachers are placed in the role of watching for signs of what is called extremism, so that a child's innocent mention of a religious conviction, a political concern, a love for the people of Palestine, for example, a love for the Ahl al-Bayt, can find its way into a file without the parent ever knowing. Let me be clear here so no one understands me. I'm not speaking against our teachers. I know many of them, and many of them are themselves alarmed at what they are being asked to deliver. I'm not saying that there is no such thing as abuse. There is, and real abuse must be confronted. I'm not saying schools have no role in protecting children. They do, and we thank God for them. What I am saying is this. The cure for abuse cannot be the dismantling of the trust between parent and child. The cure cannot be the construction of a wall between a child and the first educators God appointed for them, which is the mother and the father. Because when that wall is built on an industrial scale across a whole generation, we do not need to speculate about where it leads. The research is already in. The children most at risk in any age are not the children of believing, attentive parents who stayed close. They are the children who are severed emotionally, ideologically, spiritually from the adults who loved them the most and who were then handed over to whatever the age was pushing upon them. And so the burden this places on us in this age is the same burden that fell on Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn 1,000 years ago. We cannot outsource the formation of our children. We must know what they're being taught. We must stay in conversation with them. We must be the mother who walked her sons to the mosque of Karkh, and not the parent who handed them to a stranger or to an iPad and hoped for the best. The tradition of our Imams has always placed the family, not the state, not the institution, the family, at the center of a child's formation. That is why Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn's story is in this session tonight. Because what she did in the 4th century of Hijrah, every believing parent in every age is being asked to do again, in whatever form their given age demands. And there is one more lesson, and it's a lesson about Sheikh al-Mufid, and through him about every teacher who will ever sit before a student. Sheikh al-Mufid could have turned the mother away. He was the busiest scholar in Baghdad. He had hundreds of students waiting for him at his time. A dream is a subjective experience. He could have dismissed it as a mere coincidence or stress or the overactive imagination of an overworked man. But he did not. He saw the mother at the gate, he saw the 2 children, he remembered what he'd been shown, and in the language of the biographical sources, he wept. And he took them. Every scholar listening to this tonight, and every teacher of any subject, take this into your heart. The students who come to you are sometimes just students. And sometimes they are what Sheikh al-Mufid saw at the gate of the mosque that morning. You will not always know which is which. Treat each and every one of them as though they might be. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the training under Shaykh al-Mufid. The two brothers would train under Shaykh al-Mufid for years, and as they trained, something became clear to their teacher that the biographical sources record with some tenderness. The two brothers, though raised in the same house by the same parents and taught by the same teacher, were very different men. al-Murtadha, the elder, was the systematizer, the rationalist, the one who could take a doctrine, examine it from every angle, and construct around it a defensive architecture so thorough that no opponent could find an opening. He was the mind of the Kalam theologian, patient, methodical, unemotional, devastating when challenged. By the time Shaykh al-Mufid's death arrived, al-Murtadha was ready to inherit not just the Shaykh's students, but his methodology, and push it yet further. al-Radhi was a different soul altogether. The younger brother was a poet, the literary genius, the one whose gift was not the construction of arguments, but the capture of language. From his teenage years, he composed poetry that his contemporaries considered the finest of the age. His ear for Arabic was extraordinary. His sensibility for the rhythm and the weight of words was, as the sources tell us, unmatched amongst his peers. He could have spent his life as a poet in the courts of the Buyid princes and been remembered 1,000 years later, only as a great poet of his age. Instead, he used that gift in the service of something no one else before or since has quite managed to do. But that story belongs to next week. For now, let us leave them here. Two boys, two gifts, one mother, one father, one teacher, and a household in which every day the words of Imam Ali, their ancestor and their Imam, were spoken as though the commander of the faithful himself might walk through the door. The soil was prepared. Now, God willing, we watch what grew in it. Now, before we close tonight, let us sit for one quiet moment with what we've just walked through. Because everything the brothers will become, everything we will spend the next 3 weeks unpacking, was already there in the seed, in the opening. It was there in a mother's decision to walk her children to a mosque. It was there in a father's careful choice of names that would carry his prayer for them across 1,000 years. It was there in a teacher's willingness to weep at a dream and accept its summons. And it was there in a household where the words of an ancestor were spoken with such love that the children grew up unable to imagine a life that did not serve those words. And here is the question this opening session leaves us with, and the question I'd like you to all carry with you from this gathering, from this session tonight, into your homes, into your week, into the choices that you'll make tomorrow morning over breakfast with your children, into the conversations that you'll have at the dinner table, into the things that you will allow into your home and the things you will refuse to allow. What seed is being planted in your household tonight? Not the household of Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn in the 4th century of Baghdad. Yours. Be it in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Bournemouth, in Leicester, London, Toronto, Sydney, Detroit, Bangstree, Martinique, in whatever city this majlis reaches. What is the soil in your home, and what is being planted in it? Because the brothers who are going to give us Nahj al-Balagha and the foundations of every Hawza in the world, they did not begin as scholars. They began as boys, in a house, with a mother, with a father, with names whispered into their ears at the call to prayer, and with a household that knew from the day they were born that what was being raised within those walls was not a private matter. It was the future of a tradition. The same is true in your house and mine. The future of this tradition, the future of this community, that the Imam, may our souls be his ransom, may God hasten his return, will find waiting for him when that day comes, is being shaped this week in households like ours. May God grant us, every one of us, the eyes of Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn, the eyes that she had to see what our children may become. May God grant us the courage she had to do what is needed to prepare them for it. And may God grant us the wisdom of Sheikh al-Mufid to recognize when the moment comes, in whatever form it takes, that what is standing at our gate is not what appears to be on the surface, but something the Lord of the worlds has placed before us as a trust. And now the closing supplication. O God, Lord of Sayyedah al-Radhi and Sayyedah al-Murtadha, and Lord of Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn before them, and the Lord of every mother and every father who has ever raised children to love you and to love your friends, we thank you tonight for the gift of the two brothers whose story we have only just begun. We thank you for the mother who walked them to the mosque, and for the father who whispered their names into their ears, and for the teacher who wept at a dream and took the burden of their formation upon his shoulders. O God, make our households like the household of Sayyedah Fatima bint al-Husayn. Make our names, the names we give our children, the names we live our own lives by, names that carry your prayer for us across whatever years you grant us in this world. Make us, in the homes you have entrusted us, the parents that those children deserve. O God, we ask you, by the love you have for the descendants of your Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and righteous companions, grant us tawfiq, grant us success in our endeavors, grant us the rigor, the patience, the courage, and the humility that Sayyedah al-Radhi and Sayyedah al-Murtadha carried into every act of their lives. Let us not waste the days you have given us. Let us not arrive at our final hour with the work undone. And O God, for our beloved master, the Imam of the age, the proof of God upon the earth, the son of Hasan al-Askari, peace and blessings be upon him and upon his fathers, be in this hour and in every hour his guardian, his protector, his leader, his helper, his guide, and his watchful eye. Hasten his relief. Make his hardship easy, and count us, by your mercy, among those who labour as Sayyedah al-Radhi and Sayyedah al-Murtadha laboured, to prepare the ground for the day of his return. For the occultation continues, O Lord, because we are not ready yet. Make us ready. Let every act of our lives, every word taught to a child, every truth spoken in love, every household built on your remembrance, let it be a stone we lay on the foundations of the community he will one day lead. And O God, when our own time comes, as it came for Sayyedah al-Radhi at a mere 47, and for Sayyedah al-Murtadha at 80, grant us a good ending. The ending of those whom you have chosen and who have chosen you. Let us depart this world in the manner of these two brothers, with our work given to those who would carry it forward, and our hearts at peace with the one who created us. And let us be reunited by your mercy with the ones we have loved in this life and with the ones we have loved from afar, in a paradise where the soil of Karbala lies open beneath our feet, and the face of the Imam, may our very souls be his ransom and may God hasten his return, is the first sight our eyes meet. O God, send your blessings upon Muhammad and the family of Muhammad and hasten their relief, and may their enemies, all of them, be excluded from your mercy. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. Before we finish, there is a small teaser for what happens next week. Next week, God willing, we walk the full life of the younger brother, Sayyedah al-Radhi, from his early scholarly works through the compilation of Nahj al-Balagha, through his refusal to bow to a Khalif who tried to break him, to his early grave at the age of 47, where the vizier of the Abbasid Caliphate himself stepped in to lead the prayer his elder brother could not bear to lead. Until then, may God keep you and your loved ones in his care, and may he grant us the soil, the seed, and the patience to raise what he has entrusted to us. Wa akhiru da'wani alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.